A single trader convinced he could own the entire world's nickel supply. He was almost right. On the surface, the nickel market collapse of 1970 looks like a straightforward story. One man, unbounded ambition, a catastrophic miscalculation. Hunt brothers cornered silver in the 1980s. De Beers controlled diamonds for decades. So naturally we assume the nickel disaster was just another billionaire's hubris, a rich man betting wrong and losing everything. Except the real story is far more interesting. Because the decision that destroyed the market wasn't made by someone reckless. It was made by someone rational, operating on information that made perfect sense at the time. The accepted version says Henk Jasper, a Dutch-Indonesian trader operating out of New York, simply got too confident. He believed nickel prices would rise. He accumulated massive positions. The market turned against him, game over. And yes, those facts are technically true, but they explain nothing about why a competent trader would risk everything on a single commodity. To understand that, you need to rewind to 1969. Nickel was booming, global demand was climbing steeply. The Vietnam War was consuming metals at historic rates. Aircraft, ammunition, industrial machinery all required nickel. Production couldn't keep pace. Prices had climbed steadily for years. Every analyst, every trade publication, every reasonable observer of the market saw the same thing. Supply was tight, demand was accelerating, and prices had nowhere to go but up. For Jasper, this wasn't speculation. This was reading the market correctly. He began quietly accumulating nickel, not futures contracts, actual physical nickel, warehoused, stored, real inventory. By mid-1970, he controlled roughly 20% of the world's visible nickel supply, not through fraud, through purchase, through capital deployed into an asset that, by every metric available to him, was structurally undersupplied. But here's where the conventional story breaks down. Jasper didn't corner the market through manipulation. He cornered it because the market was actually tight. His purchases were legitimate. His inventory was real. The problem was that once he owned that much, prices started moving upward, not because he forced them, but because the market was reacting to the visible reality of scarcity. And this is the trap. Once prices rose sharply, something unexpected happened. Soviet nickel, which had been held off the market for years as a strategic reserve, suddenly became economically viable to release. Production capacity that had seemed permanently offline came back online. Producers ramped up output frantically. The supply crunch Jasper had correctly identified dissolved almost overnight. By autumn 1970, Jasper was holding 20% of global nickel inventory while supply was flooding the market. His position, which had seemed brilliant 6 months earlier, was now a catastrophic liability. But he made the decision that defined him. He didn't sell. He couldn't. If he liquidated his massive position, prices would collapse entirely. He'd be left holding inventory worth a fraction of what he'd paid. So instead, he held and held. The market waited for him to crack. Producers knew he was trapped. They ramped production further. Prices kept falling. By the end of 1970, Jasper's position had hemorrhaged roughly $100 million in losses, an astronomical sum in that era. Adjusted for inflation, he'd lost nearly $700 million in today's currency. Here's where the real explanation emerges. Jasper didn't lose because he was reckless. He lost because he made a rational bet on accurate information, then encountered a countermove he couldn't have predicted, the release of strategic reserves that shifted fundamentals overnight. He was trapped by the very success of his early accumulation strategy. But there's a second layer. Once he was trapped, exchanges and regulators panicked. They moved to restrict his ability to trade further. Nickel futures were suspended. Delivery rules were rewritten mid-game. The market essentially froze him out, not through law but through administrative action. His losses accelerated because the system itself seized up around him. The real scandal wasn't that one trader tried to corner a market. It was that he succeeded, and then the system responded by changing the rules to protect other market participants at his expense. This wasn't fraud prosecution. This was market protection. The exchanges had to act. But they acted because Jasper had exposed a vulnerability in how commodity markets handle concentrated positions. What made Jasper's decision rational at the time was data. Tight supply, rising demand, favorable long-term trends. But markets don't reward correct analysis alone. They reward correct analysis plus luck. He had the first. The second abandoned him when Soviet reserves entered the equation. That's not incompetence. That's the cost of operating in a system where you can't control all variables. The scandal's real legacy wasn't Jasper's personal ruin, though that was complete. It was the tightening of position limits across commodity exchanges, rules that still exist today, limits on how much of a single commodity any trader can hold, restrictions on leverage, cooling off periods before delivery, all built directly in response to the moment when one man's rational bet nearly destabilized the entire nickel market. So the accepted story, greedy trader bets big, loses everything, system corrects, is accurate but incomplete. The fuller truth is this: Jasper made a defensible decision with the information available. The market fundamentals supported him. But he operated in a system where he bore all downside risk while other participants could exit when circumstances changed. That asymmetry destroyed him. The lesson isn't that ambition is dangerous. It's that concentrated positions in markets with limited liquidity are fragile by design. One trader can't move a market alone, but he can expose how quickly a market can turn against him when conditions shift. Jasper's position was theoretically sound. Practically, it was a trap that snapped shut the moment supply dynamics changed. By 1971, Jasper's empire had collapsed entirely. His positions were liquidated, his fortune was gone, but the nickel market didn't actually break. It adjusted, producers increased output, prices stabilized. The physical commodity he'd accumulated was absorbed into the global supply chain at lower prices than he'd paid. From a systems perspective, the market worked exactly as designed. It punished concentration and rewarded flexibility. The 1970 nickel scandal stands as a masterclass in how rational decisions made with incomplete information can collapse when the information changes. Jasper didn't fail because he was stupid. He failed because he was right, just not right enough and not right long enough. In markets, timing isn't just everything. It's the only thing that matters. Subscribe to see how other traders made similar bets with similar information and why the next one might be different.